Okay, Wiki Church chapter 1. We're going to cover chapter 1 and 2 in this video. Again, pause it anytime you need to discuss. This first chapter is just a great read. It talks about Steve Morrell, the author. He calls himself an accidental missionary and a reluctant leader. He says, I never intended to pastor a big church, never intended to be the leader of an international mission and church planting organization. All I ever wanted to do was honor God and make disciples. And in my estimation, I think he does that incredibly well. So we've got a lot to learn from him. Read the rest of that chapter. It's just a good chapter to give you background on him. But let's get to chapter 2. He calls this one-armed judo. He tells a story at the beginning of the chapter of a wrestler who only had one arm, but he was really good because he mastered this one move. He just needed the one move and no one could defend it. And he goes on to this. He says, the one move we have as a church is this: a simple, biblical, transferable discipleship process. Now, their process is a little bit different than our process at Alpine, and that's really okay because we still learn a lot from this book. In fact, our process was informed by the way they do things. We went a few years ago, a couple of us, to Victory and spent a week with some of their leaders there. Later on, I met Steve Morrell himself, and we've learned a lot about it. We brought it back to Alpine, to Utah, and put into place the process that we're going to be talking about as we go through this entire book. But here's his point. Our goal is to engage non-believers and help them become disciples of Jesus Christ. It's not about getting church people into groups. It's about getting non-church people to Christ, and that's incredibly important. He writes, we have overwhelming confirmation in our own experience that this is one move, if mastered, that is unstoppable and indefensible. He says our goal is to make small groups and everything else we do support our discipleship process. So the discipleship process at their church is central. It's their one move. Everything else supports it. Small groups, Sunday experiences, everything supports their discipleship process. It's the one main thing they do. If you want to, you can pause this here, talk a little bit about this and whether you think that's true of our church, and if not, how we can get better at that. He goes on and says, we cannot force or require people to make disciples, nor would we even try to do so, but we do work hard to maintain and control the training system and the process of making disciples. And again, we're going to talk about that because we feel the same way at Alpine. We do the exact same thing. We work hard to develop the system of disciple making, and we want everyone to be a part of that. Now, he talks about some of the history of their own church and how they slowly grew for many years, but then eventually just exploded. And he says there's no way we would have seen the exponential growth since 1991 without shifting from a model dependent on Big Bang event evangelism to small group discipleship model. And when they started using that discipleship model, it just exploded. And now they're reaping the benefits year over year. He talks a little bit about the lesson they learned at the Star Complex, and that it was very different from their other congregations. What they learned that they were doing is they were drawing Christians from other churches rather than making disciples. He goes on, he says that it grew really fast, quickly, and it might have suggested that the great things were happening, but they knew something was fundamentally wrong. Look at what he says, and we've experienced this too. Any and every aspect of the ministry received critiques, complaints, a few demands, and usually some references to how things were done in a former church. And what they learned is they weren't making disciples. They weren't inviting people to follow Jesus who hadn't followed Jesus, but they had a high percentage of people who were from other churches, and they were consumer Christians who were just trying to find the coolest, thing, the next coolest church. Now, this would be a good one to pause on and talk a little bit about this, whether you've ever seen this at Alpine or at any other churches you've been a part of, and if at Alpine, if there's anything we need to do to make adjustments to that. Now, Morrell says that it took about 2 years to transition their church from a Sunday meeting culture to a small group discipleship culture that operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. In fact, he said that for almost 2 years, the leadership said nothing from the pulpit about the change. But he said all of our pastors and staff simply started making disciples in small groups. Now, if you've had that problem at your campus, make a note of this and think about what are you doing to make some of those changes to change the fundamental culture of your church. He goes on and says that we decided we would build a small group discipleship system for the 10,000 we had not reached, not for the 2,000 we had already reached. That's really important to think about fundamentally. What is your philosophy of ministry? Are you trying to pander to the people that are already in your church? Or are you trying to build a system where you're making disciples and you're thinking about the people who aren't yet in your seats? He goes on and says, as a leadership team, we focus now most of our attention on building, monitoring, and maintaining a simple process that equips and empowers even the youngest Christians to make new disciples. He concludes the chapter, says, no matter what is missing from your church or campus ministry, if you master just one move, making disciples in small groups, you will be unstoppable. Again, pause this before you go on to the next couple of chapters and talk a little bit about what you can learn from your own experiences and how we can apply some of these principles a little bit better in our own church.